Alright guys, today we're talking about my favorite thing, Gundam Evolution, and my least favorite thing, Overwatch. So, I'm comparing the two of these, and I promise not to be biased, I really do, this is just for informational purposes, this is not my opinion, so yeah, we're gonna go right into it. The first thing I want to say is that fundamentally, I do believe the games are very, very similar. They are the closest two games on the market to each other. So, they have very similar game modes overall, very similar map designs overall. They're just very, very similar. They're both hero shooters. They're both played in a very, very similar fashion. However, due to certain design changes and design philosophies, they feel very different. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is how the small changes make them feel very different to the point where people would play both games and say that they're not similar at all. So starting off, we're going to talk about how the units are and the characters are in Overwatch versus Gundam Evolution. So in Overwatch, the characters are very, very extreme. They have very specific roles and areas in which they're supposed to fit into. Gundam Evolution decided not to follow that path and decided to make them very standardized. So in Gundam Evolution, the tankiest tank character, which is Sazabi, only has 40% more HP than a standard unit. While in Overwatch, the tankiest unit, which is something like Roadhog or Wrecking Ball, has 200% more HP than standard. And a lot of those tank characters have armor, which reduces damage even more. Now, yes, Sazabi does have a shield and other things, so it's not like exactly like this, but so do the characters in Overwatch. So, and generally, this is a good comparison. But what they decided to do about this is give a higher amount of damage and more mobility to all the characters, and particularly the tank characters, to make up for the fact that they don't have as much HP. So they're standardized and they're given more individual impact. And this is really what this is. They're taking a lot of some of the flexibility away from things and the extremeness of things and putting it into the individual capability. So as opposed to a game like in Overwatch, when you're playing a Winston and you can't really secure solo kills very often, versus in Gundam Evolution where Sazabi can solo kill everything in the game. So this essentially is going to make the game feel a lot more like Call of Duty versus Overwatch, which is essentially a first-person shooter MOBA. This also leads in the concepts of there not being hard counters. In Overwatch, there are very frequently hard counters, and like hard counters. You can be extremely good at Winston, for example, but there's absolutely no way to beat a Roadhog in a 1v1. You simply don't deal enough damage. And the way that Roadhog's shotgun is designed will just simply beat you. Yeah, it doesn't mean you can't beat a team that has, a Roadhog on it, but in general, you can't beat them on a solo play perspective. So you have to play around them, and it's really frustrating. And that really is what it is that it's less frustrating in Gundam Evolution. You are losing some of the uniqueness and the capability to make really specialized cool compositions, but you're losing a lot of the frustration, particularly for people who play like the tanky characters, and some of the other basically not the characters that just click on heads. So moving on from here, Gundam Evolution is 6v6 and Overwatch 2 is 5v5, and that actually makes it a lot bigger deal than you would think. Assuming that we're going to talk about it from a perspective of Gundam Evolution and Overwatch 2 both having standardized team compositions, while yes, there's not actually roles in Gundam Evolution, the characters do still have they are still specialized to some extent, so they do still play in certain ways. So you can essentially just characterize them into tanks and damage and support characters. Doesn't mean you can't frag on each of them, because you can, but it's still how it goes generally. So if you're playing something like 2 tanks, 2 damage, 2 supports in Gundam Evolution, and then the forced composition in Overwatch 2, which is 1 tank, 2 damage, and 2 supports, you have a severe issue when you get a character picked or killed on Overwatch 2 that you don't have in Gundam. So, essentially the issue is that in Gundam Evolution, you're capable of having your second tank character, which is a flex tank character, and in Overwatch 2, you don't have one of those at all. You only have a single tank, which would be a main tank, regardless of what it is. A tank that would produce space and do that sort of stuff, and take areas of the map. Now, you might be looking at me like, well, that's not really a big deal, is it? But it really, really is, because flex tanks are capable of filling every single role. they're a tank, right? So obviously they tank. They also are given a lot of damage. And in characters in Gundam Evolution, this would be like right now it's Marasai is the sorry not Marasai Stormtrooper. That's the biggest example of this. But in Overwatch, it's Diva, Zarya, and Sigma. So they're able to deal a lot of damage. They're able to tank, and they're able to help sustain the team with their sustaining abilities. So what basically happens is, while yes, when a character gets picked on your team when you're on 6v6, you're only losing 1/6 of your team, and in Overwatch 2, when you get a character picked on your team, you're losing 1/5, so you're losing more. It leaves you with a severe weakness that is exploitable. Because in Gundam Evolution, you have the ability to fill these gaps. So when you have a healing character killed on your team, you can then have your Dom Trooper that still has a sustaining capability and can lean more into that part of its kit. Same thing with damage, it can lean more into the damage. And if you lose your other tank, like your Sosby, for example, you still have a Dom Trooper to help tank. Like I said, they're more standardized in this game, but still fundamentally, you can still split the characters this way. It's just you play still more for frags and stuff like that. But in Overwatch 2, if you lose one of your support characters, there goes 50% of your sustaining capabilities. If you lose one of your damage characters, there goes 50% of your core damage capability. And if you lose your tank, then there goes all of your tanking capability. And there's nothing to patch the hole. So when you pick something like this, basically the enemy team composition is very likely to just fall apart. If you pick their tank, then you take advantage of the fact that you have a tank and they don't. If you pick one of their damage characters, then you're taking advantage of that fact that you can just out damage them. And then if you lose one of their supports, then you're just going to play it slow because you know that you'll sustain them over time. So that's basically how that goes. And it essentially just makes it so there's a much lower percentage of chance of having the ability to come back at all. It makes the game way more extreme, which can be good because if you're playing on offense and you get a pick, then you're rewarded for that more. But in my opinion, and how people tend to feel in general, is that it requires that negative things feel a lot more stronger than positive things do. So the negative feeling of having someone just be picked on your team and you just lose feels a lot worse than the positive feeling of you getting a pick and you just winning. So personally, I don't like it. But then again, this isn't my opinion. This is about facts. So moving on to the next thing. Gundam Evolution has no roll lock, and Overwatch 2 has roll queue. Again, sorry guys, I keep going into my thing. I really don't like roll queue and roll lock at all. I hated them, but I know some people did. So essentially what this guarantees is that Overwatch 2 will have worse queue times unless Gundam Evolution just like Omega dies. Just because in Gundam Evolution, they're just pairing up any 6 players, and in Overwatch 2, they have to make sure there's the right number of each. And right now there's an issue with the support queue times. And I made a whole video about how about how Gundam Evolution could follow the same path that Overwatch did from Overwatch to Overwatch 2, and whether that will happen or not. I'll link it at the end of the video for this. But there's essentially that you're always going to have problems with this sort of stuff in Overwatch. It's really hard for them to balance the roles perfectly in a way that you'll have perfectly good queue times. So essentially Gundam Evolution will always have better queue times. However, because there is roll queue in Overwatch 2, it means that the games are going to be a lot more standardized, which is a negative because of the lack of creativity, a reduction in creativity, but it also means that the consistent average game is just going to be better. I know a lot of people care about that a lot more, and they'll be willing to wait for having like a better average game. I was the opposite, but then again, I was playing main tank, so I was kind of making my games a lot better just because of that. But you don't have to have the issue just coming into a game and losing because you don't have any supports or any tanks. I do have to say though, in Gundam Evolution, this isn't going to be quite as much of a problem. Like it just doesn't have the skill, it doesn't have the ceiling of being as big of a problem because all the characters are more standardized. So if you pull up and you have 5 characters that are incapable, that are just purely damage characters, not even tanky damage characters, you can still win. I'm going to tell you guys, it's going to be a lot harder. For sure, people will, like these games are designed in a way in which you need some of each of these role. You can specialize into different types of compositions. You can have like high damage compositions like you did in Overwatch fighting against goats with these like Wrecking Ball and 4 TPS comps. But It helps a lot to have like at least one support and one tank kind of thing. But it's still possible to win. Whereas in Overwatch, it just wasn't, unless the enemy team was like literally so bad. So it won't be quite as big of an issue, but it still might be somewhat. So moving on to the next thing, the healing values in Overwatch 2 are mega high, and they have been and they always will be. They're never going to change it, guys. I'm sorry. They just won't. So unless, basically what this does, and I personally don't like it, and I think most people don't like it because it takes away individual value on a fragging perspective. But essentially what it really does is, unless you're the really highest damage character, so unless you're like playing Widowmaker or Hanzo or something like that can just kill things by themselves, you're playing for a resource advantage and creating conditions so that kills can then be obtained. So if you're playing something like Orisa or Winston, you're playing to force enemy cooldowns. You're using your cooldowns to make them use more. So if you're Winston, you're jumping on the enemy's backline to try and force their Baptiste to use their lamp, but you're not going to get a kill out of it because you just can't, right? Because the effective HP that they have is going to be like upwards of like 800 with getting healed and then using lamp and stuff like that, and you're only doing 60 a second. You kind of can't stay there for 15 seconds. So you jump out, and then you go again for the next one, or to facilitate teammates to kill things. And that's what Overwatch is right now, unless you're the hit scan DPS, essentially. And so it's essentially like a team-based MOBA style game in which you're exchanging cooldowns. So you go to do something and then make them use cooldowns, then they make you use cooldowns. And whoever does that better gets an advantage, and then you push those advantages. That's what like Overwatch really is, when you like push it to a higher level of play, and even just in standard play. But essentially, individual kills are secondary. Whereas in Gundam Evolution, it is very low sustain, meaning that you get enough value hunting for single kills that you play for them primarily. But what this also does is then make the resource cooldown trading thing, the MOBA-esque part of it, secondary. I think, just personal views, I think this is just inherently the way games ideally should be. I really do like the coordination stuff. I like the specialization of things, but I think just for the average player, it is much better this way. Like, there's a reason people like playing Call of Duty and just walking up and clicking on things. Valorant. Yeah. So next thing and last thing we're going to talk about is the map design. In Gundam Evolution, the map designs have a much less consistent structure, and I would honestly just argue that they're just worse. Overwatch 2, in Overwatch, there are 3 lanes on each map. And like it goes back into this whole MOBA thing. But there's 3 lanes, right? And you have one of them on the sides is good for long range, so it's for the spam, it's for the hit scan DPS long range damage characters. And then for the other side of the map, the completely opposite side of the map is for characters that do damage from close range. So it's nice and closed up. You can go through little corridors through there and path onto the enemy backline or the objective, things like that. Meanwhile, the other side, like I was saying, is open. And it's nice and open and beautiful. In the middle is generally open with some cover in it, but that is where the objective goes through. And so then you play based around this. If you have characters that are like to do close range damage and brawl based characters, you go to the areas that are closed off where they have an advantage, where you're there away from the sight lines of the enemy that like to spam them down. And then if you have the spam characters, you do the opposite, right? And so it makes sense and it's consistent, and you can play anything on every map, generally. However, in Gundam Evolution, it's less consistent, and there's less openness to it. Just in general, there are a lot of small corridors and hard choke points that are difficult to... They're just less consistent. There's not like a rule. You can't look at the map and be like, okay, well, this is the open area, this is the closed area. And because of that, it makes it less consistent overall, which means it does make for a worse experience, I would have to argue. It also makes it so that the whole like having 3 different composition types, the spam, the dive, and then the brawl, isn't as reliable and enjoyable. And just the fact that there's a lot more tight corridors and tight choke points and tight spaces with objectives in it. It's way heavily biased towards brawl-based characters, close range damage characters. So they have to be careful when they add those characters. So we probably won't see as many of them. I'm going to make a full video about this. This is just a small section of this. I think this is a really important thing to talk about because I want Gundam Evolution to be as good as it can be. The devs have been very good about talking about their thoughts and adjusting things so far, so I'm really happy with that. But I'm going to make a full video on this one. And particularly how the objectives and the game modes also relate into this, because the maps and the game modes are really, really heavily associated with each other. Looking for some more Gundam Evolution content? Then make sure to check out these 14 mobile suit guides I did. In them, I go over the abilities of the characters, the strengths and weaknesses, when to play them, and how to play them. I go really in depth, and I think the videos are really good, so you guys should go check them out. Thank you.